Before I turn the time over to Sean and Rick, I just want to remind everyone of the Shingo Manufacturing Summit, which is coming up on August 22nd and 23rd in Minneapolis. Can we advance the screen to that screen, Sean? Uh, Comments from last year's manufacturing summit indicated that attendees really liked the intimate atmosphere of the summit because it's a smaller event, and so there's plenty of opportunity to talk to the experts teaching the various sessions. And you can learn more about this event at events.shingo.org. Also, because I know we have a few attendees from Europe today, I just wanted to mention that we also have an event in Brussels this October. That event may also be of interest to people here in the U.S. who want to do a site visit to a European company to see how things are done there. And again, you can learn the details of that event also by visiting events.shingo.org. So now let's move on to the main event. I'm going to let our hosts tell a little bit about themselves and then just go right into the presentation. Sean, would you like to give a little of your background?
Yeah, good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to be on this webinar and have what I would consider a pretty short conversation around the model and around some of the things that we're doing here at the Institute. And please do not hesitate to put your questions in. Dom will screen those out and bring them to us as they come in. Because that's a big part of this conversation, is we want to be able to answer questions that you have on the model. I also wanted to introduce Heather, who's here with us, and she takes care of our events. She's sitting down toward the end of the table along with Julie, who coordinates our assessments and that. So if you go to almost anything that we do, they'll become very familiar to your emails and potentially at one of the events. So we welcome them as well. I've been at the Shingo Institute since about 1998 in different capacities through the years. Have worked with all of the executive directors that have been at the Institute. I work with developing the assessment. I work also with all the educational products that we work with along with the model, because all of our education comes from the model. So I'm glad to be here with you, happy to answer your questions, and we'll give you information at the end if you'd like to contact Rick or myself. But I'll turn a little bit of time over to Rick now.
Hi, so I'm Rick Edgmond. I serve as the research director at the Shingo Institute. I've been here since August 2015, having moved here from Denmark, although I am an American. So I've worked in the area of quality improvement, Six Sigma, Lean, and so on for about 35 years, and have worked with a number of large companies, although I've been primarily in academic. I've worked with companies like Raytheon and GE and Hewlett-Packard and Kodak, and a number of large and small organizations over time, both public and private sector. So my research is focused predominantly on the broad area that we call operational excellence today. And that's what we're doing here at the Shingo Institute as well, as some of the research related to those sorts of topics.
So Rick helps us out a lot with, some of you may be familiar with the Insight survey that we work with, and certainly we're happy to field any questions on that as well, as we talk about the model and that. So let's get going. We don't have a lot of time. I did want to introduce just how we relate and how we're a part of of Utah State University and of the John M. Huntsman School of Business. That is where the Shingo Institute resides. We have always been there inside of the business school. The Shingo Prize, as we talk about it today, is the actual physical prize itself. The trophy that we give away, the challenge that people go after, and that is, of course, administered through the Shingo Institute. And that is true no matter where it's given around the world. So I know some of you, I've seen some folks from Mexico here today, and there's probably some folks on from Europe also. So everything flows through this office. Actually, it flows through Julie, who works to administer everything done with the assessment. So that's how we relate to Utah State University and to the Huntsman School of Business. But let's talk about the model. That's what we're here to do. This model, as many of you may recognize, this is the model that we came out with in 2008 when we began to realize that organizations that were using tools and in some cases systems, the difficulty was sustaining the results and making those trend properly over time. So we'd run into things where when we'd go back to organizations, we'd look at them and there was a change in leadership or the competitive environment changed, those type of things. And we started to look at why are these results not being able to be sustained. By sustainment, we mean continue on a positive trend. So we looked at that, and this model begins to articulate how each one of these works together. It talks to us about, if you look at the arrows in between, it talks to us about how systems are aligned to principles, and we'll talk about principles here in just a moment, but how they drive those behaviors and how they're aligned to them and how they select tools and how they impact the culture and results. And that's what this model really does. So it's not in the true sense of an implementation model. It's not an implementation model in that sense, but it does talk about how these things interact and what the characteristics are around how they interact. Implementation, of course, is a little bit different because now we're talking about those behaviors. And I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that piece of the model or not, Rick.
Well, maybe just one small piece. I don't know how all of you out there define culture, but I've got just a very simple definition because it's the one I can remember. And that's that culture is the way that we do things around here. And as soon as you use the word do, you're talking about behavior. So while just about everybody sitting here is probably very familiar with key performance indicators, you may be a little bit less familiar with key behavioral indicators. But we always look at it and say that those results that all of us are so hungry for in our organizations actually result from behaviors first. And so we do focus on culture, we do focus on the way things are done, and we do correlate those behavioral indicators with performance indicators.
Yeah, exactly. And Rick and I were actually having a conversation about this morning, and I don't think any leaders or managers out there, and this was the example we were talking about, wake up on the 1st of May and go, gee, I wonder what happened with our results in April. The reality is you're looking at things all along the way, and these are the indicators. The question is, are they key behavioral indicators, meaning are they the most closely correlated to the KPIs that you're looking for? But you look at many of these things through the month to indicate, are we going to have, is our production going to look good? Is our cost going to look good? Are our sales going to look good? We all do this. This is a way by which to begin to define those, and if need be, to eliminate some that are not good in our organization. Sometimes we have indicators that we want to lessen the effect of those indicators because they don't have a positive impact on our key performance indicators. So we look around all of those to come up with what we look at in assessments when we're looking at culture. And why culture is so important to look at is because culture is something that over time, if you look at an organization deep enough and you're experienced enough to look into those behaviors, it can't be faked. It is, as Rick said, what actually is being done. Not what we think is being done as leaders, but what is actually being done out in our places of work. So that's what makes this so valuable, and understanding these relationships so valuable.
Sean?
Yeah, well, I think just to one of Sean's points, Sean said it's the rare leader, or maybe it's not a leader at all, who on May 1st says to himself, I wonder how we did in April. Well, that's because apart from some completely unforeseeable and relatively sudden event, if you don't have your finger on the pulse of the organization and the results that are being produced and what's happening, you're probably out of touch as a leader.
Can either of you give specific examples of what you were just talking about? We have Savna asking for specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I saw that question come up. Thanks for stopping us on that, Dom. Yeah, because that's important. What are some examples of this? Well, let's say let's pick something that's simple in nature. Let's say that we're looking at our sales organization, and we want to know what it's going to look like at the end of the month, right? Well, what do we look at? What are some of the behavioral indicators that as leaders and managers we look at? Some might be the activity in the office, specifically from maybe our key salespeople, right? How are they talking about how the month is going? How busy are they on phone calls? How busy are they with going out to our customers and visiting our customers? What type of activity is going on around being able to solicit sales orders coming in? Those are all indicators of what our sales might look at the end, but what we're most interested in is what are the key indicators. So as an organization looks at their KPIs, what most closely correlates to how that KPI is going to come out, right? Either positive or negative. We want to look at it from both sides, right? But what most closely correlates, that's what we call a KBI, or a key behavioral indicator, because then we can begin to look at that, and if that is truly what correlates most closely, then we can begin to move that behavior in the direction that we want to by changing the systems that we have in place. And by looking at systems, then we begin to look at the tools that we're after and the results that we're after out of those systems. So, I mean, that's just a simple example of when we're looking at a sales organization, but there are numerous things that we look at. When we look at KBIs, production might be another one. If you're looking at production, well, what are you looking at when you're looking at it in the manufacturing sense at your production? Well, as leaders, we're looking at what's our machine uptime. How are we addressing it? Is our machine uptime increasing, decreasing? How are we keeping to tack time? Are we lessening our lead time? Are we working on those things that are barriers, which we would call waste, in our flow, so that we're decreasing the lead time? All of those things, if we look at the activity in all of those, some of those are key indicators, depending on what we're trying to move and what we're trying to measure. So hopefully that gave you some good examples to go by on how we talk about key behavioral indicators. But please, if there's more questions on that, please bring them up. So when we talk about principles, the principles, as you can see, reside up at the top of the model, and these principles are the place where all of the behaviors are that we're talking about. When we talk about ideal behaviors flow from understanding the principles and understanding them deeply, because if we can understand the ideal behaviors, then we know where we want to take those key behavioral indicators. We know how we're measuring behavior, and we know the direction in which we want to move behavior so that those key behavioral indicators become more positive over time. Or We look at the indicators that we want to diminish or eliminate from our organization, and this also gives us the ability to do that. So this is the place that those behaviors reside. And as we look a little bit deeper into each one of them and into each principle, each one of these principles has key behavioral indicators and it has ideal behaviors as we look deeply into each one of them. Go ahead.
Yeah, the point that I'd like to make is that we don't assert at all that these are the only 10 principles that are out there. What we do assert is that these are 10 very important principles at the core of operational excellence. So if you were to, for example, look at the roughly 10,000 companies worldwide that ascribe to the principles of the United Nations Global Compact, they would be adding things like anti-corruption. So naturally, we know that there are other principles, but these are the ones that we focus on as part of a culture of operational excellence.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rick. And it's to that point, it's less important about what you call it and more important about how you deal with it and how you look at the behaviors around that. I mean, we even here in the office today, we talk about, should we call it seek perfection or should it be called something else? But it always gets back to what does it mean, right? What does it come down to? What are the ideal behaviors around seek perfection or any one of the other principles? The other thing to keep in mind is these aren't principles that we came up with. These principles were all discovered by other people like Shingo and Womack and Deming and all the great thought leaders that have been out there over time that have come up with these principles, and we have just brought them together in a model. So it's very easy to see when you look at cultural enablers and we begin to look at ideal behaviors around that. Well, that's got a lot of Covey's thinking in it. Covey's thinking is around principles in general. So we brought them together into a model so again we could articulate the relationship between principles, behaviors, systems, tools, results, and the culture. And that's why we've done in this nature. Go ahead.
Sure, and I think it's important to recognize that when you look at the few words that are attached to each one of these principles, that they really are just a few words that are trying to capture some large idea. So for example, when we say create value for the customer, we recognize that there are many stakeholders, the customer of which is one. So internally, we often talk about create value for our stakeholders. Or when we talk about create constancy of purpose, we recognize that no organization is an unchanging monolith. We understand that the real idea there is that we need to have unity of purpose and a shared vision for the organization to move forward. So there are several of these that we could tweak the words and so on and find some somewhat different way to express the ideas. But just recognize that on every single one of these, that we're only putting a few words to a much bigger idea.
Yeah, and you can see how Rick just began to look at two dimensions and how they work together. So that brings up an important part about principles, right? Mm-hmm. They all work together. It's very hard to look at one principle exclusively without its relationship to other principles. So an example of that would be continuous improvement and cultural enablers. Mm-hmm. It is wrong to think of cultural enablers as the cultural piece of this model, because they are what they say. They are the enablers. They enable behaviors to happen in other places. So getting back to our example between continuous improvement and cultural enablers, true enough, I can have continuous improvement in my organization and not be anywhere near the ideal behavior that I'd like to be with cultural enablers. The question is, how successful or how much more potential do I have with my continuous improvement behaviors if I have the cultural enablers in place? It's a significant difference. It's leaps and bounds beyond where I might be without those cultural enablers in place. Just think of it from your suggestion systems, or think about it if I'm the type of leader that comes down and I tell you what improvements need to be made, versus being humble enough to understand that you're closer to the process and you know what improvements need to be made, usually a lot better than I do. So just by looking at those, you can see how these work together and how important it is to understand all of them, yet we can't focus on all of them at one point in time. Just like you can't focus on every KPI that you would like to all at the same time, or every KBI that you would like to all at the same time. We have to prioritize these things. We have to look at our business and see which ones we have to do first. And that's why the approach to every facility or every plant or every business is different, because they're at a different point with each principle, they're at a different point with each dimension, and they're at a different maturity level with behaviors in general. So,
well, just one other thought is, everybody that's participating here today knows results are the holy grail. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for results, but results are end of the pipe. What we're trying to do is identify ways that we can make that pipe flow better and produce better results in the end.
Absolutely. And so through understanding what I've been talking about on ideal behaviors and key behavioral indicators, that it makes it easier to go into a facility, any facility, including your own, understand the gap and be able to predict what is going to happen with the KPIs. So it all gets down to that ability to be able to predict those things, because if we can predict them, then it also means that we can understand how to move those so that we can move closer toward what we would call the ideal results that we're looking for. So let's go into those because we're already beginning to touch on some of the key insights that we've discovered as we've been working with this model over the years. So we've got three key insights that we want to talk about this morning. And one of them is ideal results require ideal behavior. So the closer we can move our behavior toward the ideal, which of course means we have to understand what those key ideal behaviors are, because again, there are many of them as we just discussed. The closer we can move those toward the ideal, the better we can move our results toward those goals and toward those ideal results that we are seeking in anything that we do, in any of the KPIs that we're looking for.
Yeah, just a comment. By ideal, we don't necessarily mean perfect. We recognize that perfection is a moving target. So connected with ideal is the idea of sustainably better and better and better results. That's what we're looking for. And also recognize that we don't have a one-size-fits-all idea of what an ideal behavior is. That's context-driven by virtue of what your organization does, who it's doing it for, and so on.
Absolutely spot on, and that leads us into the discussion of the same thing is true with behaviors, right? Rick just said your KPIs move; they don't jump from here to here. Neither do behaviors, right? We move behaviors along a scale, but you have to know what your goal is. In the case of behaviors, it's ideal behavior. In the case of your KPIs, it will be the stretch goal or the goal that you set for your organization. But the better you become at moving the behaviors closer to ideal, the more accelerated you can also move your KPIs. And you'll begin to discover KPIs that you never even thought were possible. So it may not be perfection, but it's a lot closer toward perfection than we were when we started.
Well, that's right, because realistically, KPI, KBIs, all those they're substitutes. They're substitutes for the real deal. And we're always trying to move closer and closer and closer to what the real deal is so that we can produce results that are better and better.
So the next question becomes, if it is ideal behavior, that we're looking for. How do we drive behavior in that direction? And that's our second insight, right? Systems drive behavior. The way we design our systems and the way we look at the behavior that those systems are intended to produce and intended not to produce, right? So we're constantly assessing these systems to see what behaviors they're driving. But the better we design those, the better incentive there is for people that are using those systems to move toward ideal behavior. We're constantly shifting them toward the behavior that we desire, or the direction of the behavior that we're trying to move it in. Again, keep in mind, we don't go from where we're at today and the behavior that we have today directly to ideal behavior. So that, by definition, means that we're constantly shifting those systems to be in alignment with the maturity that we're currently at. We can't take a system and just jump to when we're not ready to jump. Otherwise, that creates conflict within our organization, because our organizations right now are running with the systems that they're designed to run with.
Absolutely. Sean, can you comment on the questions that Adriana and Sean have?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, how do you measure improvements in behavior? Great question, right? So as we look at that, here's how we look at behavior. We look at it by the role, who's doing the behavior. So role, and then frequency, intensity, duration, and scope. So frequency, we talk about how frequent is that behavior happening, not only with an individual or in a small group, but over the scope of our organization, right? Do we see, let's just take an easy one. When we look at continuous improvement, for example, and we look at an organization, we may have different maturity levels, right? So we may see a maturity level that, we've been to this area and we worked on improvements in this area. We did it with our lean team and the folks in the natural work group. And then we moved on to another area. That's one maturity level. And remember that none of the things that I'm talking about are right or wrong. They're just a maturity level of where an organization is at. Or we might go into another organization and see that, wow, teams are doing improvement every single day. They're thinking about things every day. They don't have to wait for a team to come. It's not an event. It's just happening every day. Two different types of maturity levels, right? So again, when you get back to frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role, how long has it been going on, right? How intense is it? Intensity is the idea that when our organization becomes busy and our production is up to 95% capacity, let's say, do all of a sudden all the improvement activities stop? Mm-hmm. If they do, that's less intense than if they continue on. Again, it's a maturity level, right? Who is doing the improvements is just as important. Is it management and leadership coming down and doing the improvements and dictating what the improvements ought to be? Now, in some cases, that's appropriate. It depends on what improvement we're dealing with and what level we're dealing with. So the level of whether it's an associate, a manager, or a leader also changes what the appropriateness of that improvement might be. So when we look at behaviors, those are the things we look at. Now, remember those things I just talked about, those measures that I talked about, frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role, those can also be used to look at bad behavior or the behavior we don't want. I don't like to say bad, but it's the easiest way for people to understand it. But the behaviors that we don't want in an organization, if we look at that by frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role, what that tells us at looking at that gap is the level of effort that we are going to have to remove that behavior from the organization. Because if it's intense, and it's done at many roles through the organization, it's throughout the whole organization, and it's been going on for a long time, we're going to have to really work at getting rid of that out of the organization, just as hard as we work at putting the behaviors in or designing the systems that we want to get the behaviors that we do want in there. I hope that answered your question, but that's how we look at measuring behaviors. It sounds probably more complicated than it really is, because once you become, and actually, if you want to look at those scales and that is available for you in the guidelines. I should mention that. You can download them and look at specifically what those mean and how we look at that on an assessment to measure behavior. But great question, and thanks for asking that question. Was there another part to that question, Dom, that I missed?
No, I think we're good on that. I do want to just say a little bit. Sean Nolan, this is for you. You know, if you think about things like temperature and volume and pressure and weight and who knows what else, we think of those as easy to measure. But remember, at some point in time, those were just ideas, and people came up with some idea, some way to capture that idea or to make numerical that idea. We have to do the same thing with behaviors. And Sean had used this key word, maturity. And sometimes you have to recognize that you're going to start with something that maybe isn't the best way to measure, but at least you can say, this is better than this, is better than this, is better than this. And you can see that sort of graduation. And what that means is you may have to do it descriptively, you know, rather than just say this is a 5 and a 5.629 and so on. Do it descriptively and gradate growth in the sort of behavior that you see. So that can be helpful. And Sean is far too modest to take credit for this, but he has developed literally, I think, a listing of hundreds of key behavioral indicators. And I refer to those as pure gold. So please do take a look at what he referred to.
So Rick brought up a good point here about getting better and better. And the reason that's so important is because, true enough, we have to have the end in mind. We have to know what the ideal is. Mm-hmm. But by articulating what we want to look like at our journey or at our at each point along our journey up to ideal, being able to define that is really important because it changes the way we want to build the system. Mm-hmm. And it changes the way in your organization the appropriateness of get you there. And if we don't define those, then it's sometimes difficult to know where we are on that journey, how close we're getting.
Absolutely, and I think probably most people that are involved in this today are engaged in some sort of project management from time to time. So if you look at a project, you have toll gates along the way. And in some sense, that's what you're trying to do, is establish what it is you need to look like at certain points along your journey as you're doing this, and think of those like toll gates. You're just trying to make some progress and define what that progress looks like.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. Very, very true. And being, you know, I think one of the most important things is being able to be flexible along that journey. I mean, we talk with leaders that are transforming organizations almost every day, and one thing to me that always rings true is what we thought was going to happen with the system sometimes doesn't happen the way we thought it was going to happen. You know, a lot of times we look at systems in other organizations and we go, gee, we'd really like to adapt that to our organization. But once we start adapting it, we get a different behavior out of it than the other organization did. Again, that's because of where organizations are at and different pieces in their culture that are factors that are impacting that system. Systems are just like principles. They don't work in isolation. They work with all the other behaviors that are going on around them. That's why when you look at all of your systems, you will see that there are behaviors in one system that are actually just as important in another system that you're using. And that's appropriate. That's how it should happen. So keeping all those in mind are, I guess, some of the complexities around the simpleness of how this sounds, right?
Sure.
Because it sounds simple, but we all know that, and especially all of you know, you're out there in the field trying to make transformations in your organizations. It's hard when we're actually trying to apply this and change our organizations.
So Sean, it looks like there are a couple interesting questions there. I don't know if they're within the scope of what we have time for.
Yeah. Mark asks, do leaders drive behaviors as well because they are influencers?
Oh, absolutely. That's a good part of our training, and that's, as you go to our first workshop, which we call Discover Operational Excellence, it talks about that, and to his point, leaders, managers, and associates, they all influence behavior in the organization. They all influence culture. The question that he's bringing up is, how much do they influence, right? And that's, of course, very dependent on the leader and on the organization. And let me give an example of that. You could have a long-term associate in your organization that, let's say they've been there 35 years. They, in some cases, will have huge influence over the other associates in that organization because they've been there a long time. They're very knowledgeable about that organization. The same is true with leaders, and they may influence different things in different ways. But absolutely, leaders have influence over organizations, and are actually key influencers, especially over the direction and the strategy of the organization, which dictates a lot of the results that we're after.
Well, sure, and I've got a quick one for you, Chris. You'd ask about systems. I'm going to give you a name and refer you to about a 12-minute YouTube video that I think you'll find both entertaining and informative. It's old and it's a little grainy, but it's well worth a watch. So the name is Russell, Russell, Russell Ackoff, Ackoff. And Russell Ackoff is kind of regarded as the father of modern systems thinking. But if you look for a YouTube video called If Russell Ackoff Had Given a TED Talk, you'll find that one really informative, and again, I hope entertaining as well to a degree.
Great reference, Rick, for that. And just keep in mind, Chris, that we are talking about management systems, but we're also talking about improvement systems and work systems. So we're talking about all of those type of systems that are in our organization.
One other question that Paul asked, I think that we ought to answer. Rick, you mentioned hundreds of behaviors that Sean had been working on, and Paul was asking, where can we access those?
Yeah, so those are actually used in our training, and that we don't just send them out at this point. But if you get into one of the Enable or the Align or the Improve workshops or the Build workshops, currently we use that in training. We also use them with our examination teams of that, because that's an important part of examining. But we do give examples of those in our model booklet. So if you grab the model booklet, that'll give you kind of a flavor for what those look like as we look at each one of the principles and that. So I hope that'll begin to spark some thinking around that. But there are some of those in the model book. There's also a richness of resource in the guidelines. So as you look at in the guidelines, you'll see some of the questions. Again, they're just a listing of examples, but there's some of the questions around the dimensions that examination teams are trying to answer in that. So those two resources will definitely help with that. All right, while we've still got time, I'm going to move on to the last insight, and it's principles inform ideal behavior. So we talked a lot about principles here and where they are in the model. This is really key and important because, as I told you, principles are discovered, right? We don't invent them; they're discovered. They've been discovered by many of the thought leaders, and getting in depth to understanding those principles, not just the business case for the principle, but also the human side, or what I call the human side of the principle, is key to understanding ideal behaviors. So on the surface, it's relatively easy to identify the business case for it. And most of us would be familiar with the business case, for example, for flow and for seeking perfection and these type of things, right? The business case is more out front. But the individual case for it, and this is what our courses get into, is deeply understanding that principle, because what that gives us the ability to do is not only understand where ideal behaviors flow from, but if we understand where they flow from, we can better understand how we need to move our organization in the direction of the ideal behavior. And that's what's really critical to us as leaders and managers, right? Is how do we move that? Because remember, in the end, it's about getting the results that we need. I commonly get the question from folks about, how do I influence leadership? How do I get leadership to understand why this model is important? And for me, the answer always gets back to leaders, managers, and even associates, all at different levels. What do we care about? Getting results. We need to get results in our organization, whether that's results about how innovative our organization is, whether it's results about being competitive from a lead time perspective, whether it's results from a cost perspective, wherever that result is, that is what we are after. That is what influences us as leaders and managers, is getting those results. So we have to take these and work with them in parallel, because we have to get those results. And if we're not moving behaviors in our organization and getting better results at the same time, then it begs the question, then what are we doing? What are the behaviors that we're moving toward, and why aren't we getting better results? It's not that it's not important to get them, it's that our focus or where we're moving may be incorrect.
Well, it's sort of that idea of without results, who cares?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you look at this model, it's really important to look at results and culture. They work with each other. That's what we're trying to get. That's the output. The output is great results. That is the prize. The prize is that we get great results. And when we look at people that are challenging for the prize, that's what we're talking about. You've got to be getting good results, because after all, that's why we would continue to do behaviors that we have in the organization, is because hopefully we're getting those great results. Those behaviors flow from the principles, and understanding the principles, and then being able to work with the systems to be able to drive closer toward those behaviors.
Yeah, and the principles are not magic. I mean, we all have everyday sayings that we use that revolve around principles. What goes up must come down. What goes around comes around. So, we're used to dealing with principles. It's just that in this model, we deal with those principles of operational excellence.
So those are the key insights that we wanted to talk about today, and I hope we've given you a flavor for the model and enough depth that you can understand how this model can help you, regardless of what your current model is and how you work on continuous improvement. We don't want you to take this and say this. We want to make what you're doing better. We want to make the current system that you have in your organization better. We don't want you walking away going, this is another program, because if that's where it's at, then it doesn't have the richness that this model has in it. The richness is being able to take what you currently have, all the values you currently have, the current improvement system that you have, and make it more robust, and make it something that will move your results the direction that you want to move them.
That's right.
So Are there other questions, Dom? I know we're just about out of time here.
Yeah, maybe we can slide.
Rick and I could obviously sit here and talk about this forever, but I think we have time for a few questions.
Maybe we can slide this one.
Yeah, and while we're waiting for a question, I'll just say, I assume that you're seeing all of us on the screen. Well, you see us in our everyday state. If you go to the manufacturing summit, we're going to be dressed a little bit nicer, but fundamentally, we're kind of roll up our sleeves type guys. And so our emphasis is on helping organizations become better. And you don't do that without rolling up your sleeves.
Yeah, absolutely. So please, if you are at one of our conferences, hopefully we see you at the manufacturing summit that's coming up in Minnesota or in Europe. Please, we'll put aside as much time as we possibly can to talk with folks. We generally have conversations going on at lunch tables, and it's what we do a lot of. So please use us for a resource. Send us emails. We're more than happy to help where we can. We are limited, so I do want to bring up one other resource that we have, and that's our affiliates. And this is why we've gone to the distribution model for our courses that we have. Most of our courses are taught by our affiliates, and you can go to the website. You can see who those affiliates are throughout the world. And the reason we went to that is because we only have a certain amount of bandwidth. There's only a few of us here at the Shingo organization. I believe we have 10 full-time staff members, and then other part-time folks that work with us, but that's not a large organization. We do not have the bandwidth to do consulting in most cases, and so we don't do that, but all of our affiliates do have the bandwidth to do that, and that's why we use that network, so that when people have questions, when people have particular issues that they're trying to deal with, we have the resources out there within our affiliates to do that. So I'd encourage you to look at who those folks are as well. There's just a wealth of information on our website. Other questions as we kind of wrap up here?
Sean, let's slide one in from John, one that John asked just a little bit ago. How would someone handle situations where top management thinks we're good enough? Can we be successful with these changes at the lower level?
Yeah, that's interesting, and actually the answer is yes, because we have a lot of folks that do that, right? Because good enough is only limited by what we think, right? And back to a lot of the conversations that we've had with organizations through the years. I can think specifically in my mind right now. I'm thinking about one leader in particular where what he thought was good at one point in time, they're far beyond that now. And he's not what he's not quite sure of now is how far they can go. Because the goals that they set now are so much higher than they used to set, and they're reaching some of them. And even if they don't reach some of the ones that they're reaching, they're way better than they ever were by setting those goals. So can you do it at lower levels in the organization? Absolutely, unless somebody is specifically telling you that you shouldn't get any better, which I don't think is the case in at least any organization I've been associated with. People always want to get better. People always want to strive to get better, and we should always push ourselves to get better. So, although you may be getting great results now, which there are many organizations that are getting great results, I can't ever see anybody not wanting to get better. If there was a way to do it and it made the organization better, I would think most leadership would be supportive of that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's not always a matter of starting at the top by any means. If you think of it as sort of a proof of concept approach, a lot of times what leadership wants to see is that proof of concept in the first place.
Absolutely.
And we're better to have that proved out than somewhere down the chain.
Yeah, I guess the other way I would look at that, as I think about that, is I always think change is a in large part a function of approach.
Mhm.
So how we approach the change and what we want to do, and how, our relationship with, in this case, it would be leadership. So the approach that we take is critical, and that's why, going back to when I said, this model or our approach to looking at behaviors and that, it's not another program. In many cases, you're already doing it. We want you to make your program better because we feel that approaching it as another program, in some cases, destines it to not be as successful as it possibly could be. Right? So approach. So think about it when you approached maybe standard work. If your approach to standard work, if you were talking to me, and your approach to standard work was you simply wanted me to detail out everything that I do, the sequence that I do it in, the timing that I do it in, and you don't explain anything beyond that, I begin to look at it and go, are they thinking about replacing me?
Mhm.
Is this why they want me to write down? Because this is my value to the organization. How I do things and the quality that I get on the other end is part of my value to the organization. So the other way of approaching it is around a scientific thinking approach,
Mhm.
right? Because standard work, we do standard work because things that fall out of standard become a problem, right? Or become an abnormality. And we want to do standard work so that when we do have abnormalities, we can go back, look at the standard, and see why we fell out of the standard. Perhaps there's a better standard.
Mhm.
Perhaps there's a better way of doing things now. There should always be a better way of doing things. Perhaps we haven't updated it yet. But if I look at that now from a scientific approach, I'm now looking at things very differently because I'm looking at a way by which I can make my work better, faster, easier to do. That's what that's all about. It's not about what I was thinking about earlier. So I think approach in all changes that we do is very critical. How we approach it, how we table the conversation is critical to our success when we're doing these. Not only with leadership, but with associates as well. And understanding how we're doing that.
I'm going to give, I guess, my final word on this, which is Sean had just used the word better. In using something like the Shingo model, what you're looking for is not using it as a one-time thing. This is ongoing. Most companies use things like this as sort of an annual assessment tool. And think of it in the same way that you think of going to the doctor. When you go to the doctor, you want to know two things. You want to know how you're doing, and you want to know how to get better. And that's what we're looking for from the model, is that we're looking for insight or feedback in how we're doing, but we're looking for foresight about how to become better. Not a prescription per se that just says do this, do this, do this, but that gives us direction on where to go in the future if we want to become a better organization. And we think that the Shingo model is very effective at delivering those sorts of things.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, and Rick and I have another commitment in about 2 minutes. As you can tell, though, we love to talk about this. If we haven't answered your question, please send us an email. We're more than happy to talk with you and get you the answers that you're looking for. I hope this has been valuable time for you. It certainly has for us, and just to be able to share a little bit of our experiences that we've had over the years with the model. Hope we see you at one of our events coming up, at one of the conferences or one of our study tours. Look forward to working with you more in the future. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.